In March 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was at its most terrifying. German U-boats were hunting Allied shipping in organized Wolfpacks, coordinating attacks across hundreds of miles of open ocean, and the results were catastrophic beyond anything the Allied command had prepared for. In that single month of March 1943, German submarines sank approximately 567,000 tons of Allied shipping. Merchant ships loaded with food, oil, ammunition, aviation fuel, and the raw materials Britain needed to survive were going to the bottom at a rate that genuinely threatened to end the war in Germany's favor before the United States could bring its full industrial power to bear. A Royal Navy assessment from those weeks concluded without ambiguity that the Germans had never come so close to severing the Atlantic lifeline as they did in those first 20 days of March 1943. The convoys were being ripped apart. The escorts were overwhelmed. Admiral Dönitz, the architect of the Wolfpack campaign, had every reason to believe his submarines were winning. 2 months later, in May 1943, the Allies sank approximately 40 German U-boats in a single month. Not 2, not 5, 40. Nearly 1/4 of the entire German operational submarine fleet was destroyed in 30 days. 1,832 German submariners were killed in that month alone. The Wolfpack fleet that had brought the entire Allied strategic position in the Atlantic to the edge of collapse was suddenly hemorrhaging boats and trained crews at a rate that had no parallel in the previous 4 years of the war. Dönitz himself, reviewing the figures from Lorient, called it a heavy and unexpected blow. He used the words that commanders use when the world has inverted beneath them, and they have not yet found the language for what actually happened. This is the story of Black May 1943, how the most successful submarine campaign in naval history collapsed in a single month, what made that collapse possible, what the men on both sides experienced as it happened, and why what occurred in the North Atlantic between May 1st and May 31st, 1943 changed the course of the Second World War as completely as any land battle of the conflict. To understand how catastrophically and suddenly the tide turned, you have to understand what the Wolfpack actually was and why it had been so devastatingly effective for so long. The U-boat campaign under Dönitz was built around a tactical concept that was simultaneously simple and brilliant. An individual submarine hunting alone was powerful but limited. It could attack one convoy, engage one target, and it could be detected, cornered, and depth-charged by a determined escort group. The submarine's weakness was isolation. It could be hunted. But Dönitz understood something that pre-war naval strategists had not fully worked through. What happened if you did not send one submarine against a convoy? What if you sent 20? The Wolfpack made this question into a doctrine. Dönitz positioned lines of submarines across the convoy routes, waiting. When a submarine located a convoy, it did not attack immediately. It shadowed. It radioed its position and the convoy's course and speed back to Dönitz's operational headquarters. Dönitz directed every other available submarine in the patrol line to converge on the contact. And then, when 10 or 15 or 20 submarines had gathered around a convoy moving at 8 knots through the North Atlantic, they attacked together after dark, from multiple directions simultaneously. The mathematics of defense against this were terrible for the Allies. A convoy escort of 5 or 6 destroyers and corvettes could manage one contact at a time. They could chase one submarine, prosecute one sonar contact, drop depth charges on one position. When the Wolfpack attacked from 6 directions simultaneously, the escorts had to choose, and whatever they did not choose kept attacking. The Wolfpack's strength was not the power of individual submarines, but the impossibility of defending against all of them at once. In 1941 and into 1942, this had worked with devastating effect. Dönitz's submariners called the early period their happy time, and the name reflected reality. Convoys were being torn apart, with relatively modest losses in return. In the 4 months from July to October 1942, German U-boats sank over 1 million tons of Allied shipping per month, month after month. Britain depended on between 50 and 60 million tons of imported materials per year to survive and sustain its war effort. America depended on Atlantic shipping to move the troops and equipment that would eventually form the invasion force for Europe. If Dönitz could close the Atlantic, he could potentially end the war without Germany ever fighting the decisive land battle the Allies were building toward. By early 1943, Dönitz had over 160 operational U-boats in the Atlantic. He was losing submarines but building new ones faster than they were being sunk. The net force was growing. The math appeared to favor him. What Dönitz did not fully understand in March 1943 was that the Allied response that had been developing steadily and quietly since 1942 was about to converge into something the Wolfpack had no answer for. Not one improvement, but 5 separate improvements arriving at roughly the same time, in the same theater, targeting the same operational vulnerabilities that the Wolfpack depended on. Each improvement alone would have made a difference. Together, they produced May 1943. The first change was radar. By early 1943, Allied patrol aircraft and escort ships were being equipped with centimetric wavelength radar sets that represented a fundamental technological step beyond the earlier systems the U-boats had learned to evade. The older metric wavelength radar operated at frequencies that German engineers had detected and for which they had developed the METOX receiver, a device that warned U-boat crews when they were being swept by radar emissions and allowed them to dive before the aircraft arrived. The new centimetric sets operated at wavelengths the METOX receiver could not detect at all. The U-boat crew on the surface at night had no warning. The aircraft closing at 200 miles an hour had detected them from 15 miles away and was already descending for the attack run. The protection the night had offered since the beginning of the campaign was gone, and the U-boats did not know it was gone because the METOX was still telling them the skies were clear. The second change was high-frequency direction finding, which the Allies called Huff-Duff. The Wolfpack system required constant radio communication. Individual submarines had to report convoy contacts to Dönitz's headquarters, receive orders coordinating the attack, update their positions, and communicate with the other boats converging on the target. Every transmission was a radio signal that direction-finding equipment could locate. By 1943, escort vessels had been fitted with their own shipboard Huff-Duff receivers, allowing the escorts around a convoy to immediately detect and triangulate the position of any U-boat transmitting nearby. What had been the Wolfpack's operational nervous system had become a liability. Every order Dönitz sent and every report his submarines transmitted was advertising their positions to the ships they were trying to destroy. The third change was coverage. The mid-Atlantic air gap had been the Wolfpack's sanctuary and killing ground throughout the early years of the campaign. Land-based patrol aircraft from Canada, Britain, and Iceland could not reach the central Atlantic. In this zone, roughly spanning the waters south of Greenland, U-boats could attack on the surface in daylight without any fear of aircraft. The introduction of very long-range B-24 Liberator bombers modified for maritime patrol was finally closing this gap in early 1943. The coverage was not yet complete in March, but it was extending westward week by week, compressing the zone of aerial immunity that the Wolfpack depended on. Additionally, the introduction of escort carriers, small carriers converted specifically for convoy support, brought aircraft directly with the convoys rather than depending on shore-based patrol. A convoy with an escort carrier attached carried its own air cover wherever it went, regardless of its distance from land. The fourth change was weapons and tactics. Captain Frederick John Walker of the Royal Navy had developed new anti-submarine attack methods that fundamentally changed the geometry of the hunt. Walker's creeping attack used 2 ships in coordination. One ship maintained sonar contact with the submerged U-boat and communicated verbally to direct a second ship to drop depth charges, with the attacking ship operating at slow speed and producing minimal noise so the submarine crew below had no warning from propeller sounds before the charges arrived. The older depth charge attacks had involved a single ship running over the contact and dropping charges in patterns, but this required the attacking ship to accelerate over the target, and the sound of the approaching propellers gave the submarine a few seconds of warning to maneuver. Walker's method eliminated that warning. The Royal Navy also introduced the Hedgehog, a weapon that fired a pattern of 24 small contact-fused charges ahead of the attacking ship, allowing the ship to maintain sonar contact throughout the attack run rather than losing it in the turbulence produced by conventional depth charges. The fifth change was quantity. New destroyer escorts and frigates specifically designed for mass production and optimized for convoy escort duty were entering service in significant numbers. Support groups were being formed. dedicated anti-submarine hunter-killer groups, with no primary convoy to protect, but available to be rushed to the assistance of any threatened convoy at high speed. These groups could be directed by Western Approach's command to reinforce the escorts of a convoy under attack within hours of the initial contact report, suddenly producing a defensive force far greater than anything the convoy had started with. The Wolfpack's numerical advantage was being met by a flexible reinforcement system that could concentrate Allied strength wherever the Germans concentrated their attack. None of these changes had arrived fully formed overnight. Each had been developing through 1942 and into early 1943. The technology had been improving, the training had been advancing, the numbers had been growing. What made May 1943 different from March 1943 was not that the Allies invented something new in April. It was that the accumulation of improvements across all 5 areas finally reached a level where they all operated effectively and simultaneously in the same battle space at the same time. The Wolfpack that had mastered the North Atlantic in 1941 and 1942 was facing a fundamentally different opponent in May 1943, and it did not realize this until the losses began to pile up in a way that could not be explained by bad luck or aggressive Allied tactics alone. The battle that historians now identify as the specific turning point, the engagement that demonstrated most clearly that the mathematics had inverted, was the fight around convoy ONS-5 in late April and early May 1943. Convoy ONS-5 was a slow westbound convoy, 42 merchant ships bound from Britain to North America, that departed Liverpool in late April 1943. Its close escort was Commander Peter Gretton's group, 6 warships in total, including 2 destroyers, 1 frigate, and 4 corvettes. Modest protection for 42 ships crossing the most dangerous ocean on Earth. Dönitz had massed an enormous Wolfpack to intercept it. Over 50 U-boats were deployed in patrol lines across the North Atlantic shipping routes. When one of those patrol lines made contact with ONS-5 on April 28th south of Greenland, the initial conditions appeared to favor the Germans dramatically. Howling Atlantic gales scattered the convoy ships and strained the escorts. In the initial contacts, 5 or 6 submarines managed to shadow the convoy and strike. 1 merchant ship was torpedoed and sunk in those first contacts. Western Approach's command in Liverpool recognized that a major battle was developing and responded by dispatching reinforcements. Escort Group 3, 5 British destroyers, was sent from St. John's, Newfoundland and arrived on April 30th, bringing the convoy's total escort up to 14 warships. Faced with unexpectedly stiff resistance and poor results, Dönitz briefly paused the attack on May 1st. It was a tactical adjustment, not a retreat. The storm had forced some Allied escorts to refuel or return to port, temporarily reducing the screen around the convoy. ONS-5, delayed by the weather and straggling in the swell, blundered into a second Wolfpack patrol line on May 4th. This one was composed of 29 submarines waiting directly across its path. Dönitz ordered every available boat to converge. What followed was one of the fiercest convoy battles of the entire Atlantic campaign, and it began with the Germans doing exactly what the Wolfpack was designed to do. As darkness fell on May 4th, dozens of U-boats pressed home attacks from every angle. The torpedo salvos found targets. Over the nights of May 4th and 5th, the convoy lost 12 merchant ships sunk, 12 ships in 48 hours. The situation looked as grim as anything since March. The escorts were running at full stretch, trying to cover contacts in every direction through turbulent seas in the dark. From the perspective of the U-boat crews, this looked like the campaign at its best. The Wolfpack was working, but Allied advantages were already operating in ways the U-boat crews could not see from their attack positions. A Royal Canadian Air Force patrol aircraft had already caught U-209 approaching the convoy and damaged it so severely that the submarine sank several days later. On May 5th, heavy fog rolled in, reducing surface visibility to almost nothing. This shift, which might seem to favor neither side, actually favored the Allied defenders decisively. The fog blinded U-boat lookouts, but Allied radar could still detect submarine positions through it. The U-boats surfacing to reposition were being detected at distances their lookouts could not see. The technology gap that the centimetric radar had created was now producing results in real time in the middle of the battle. Additional support arrived. Escort Group 1, more British sloops and frigates, reinforced the convoy's protection. With calmer seas by May 6th, the escorts could make full use of their sonar and their new tactical coordination. The systematic creeping attacks that Walker's methods had pioneered were being executed by trained crews who understood how to keep a submarine pinned and work it down methodically. The hunter had become the hunted in the middle of the same convoy battle where the hunting had started on the other side. Over May 5th and 6th, the escort sank 5 U-boats, 4 by the close escort and 1 by the support group. When Dönitz finally broke off the attack, the exchange rate that had defined the entire Atlantic campaign had reversed. 13 merchant ships had been sunk, 6 or 7 U-boats had been destroyed, nearly 40 submarines had participated in the attack, but the result was a defensive victory. The convoy had survived with the majority of its ships intact, and the Wolfpack had paid a price that no previous convoy battle had extracted. One German U-boat man later described the ONS-5 battle as the Stalingrad of the Atlantic. The comparison was to the catastrophic German defeat on the Eastern Front that had occurred just months earlier, and that had broken the offensive capacity of the German army in the East. The same reversal was occurring in the Atlantic, and the men who had lived through it recognized the analogy. But ONS-5 was only the beginning of what May 1943 would become. Dönitz did not recognize immediately what had happened. He continued to deploy Wolfpacks against the North Atlantic convoys throughout the month, expecting that the ONS-5 losses were an aberration, a difficult battle rather than a symptom of fundamental change. What he encountered was engagement after engagement following the same new pattern. Convoy HX-237 in mid-May was protected by the British C-2 escort group reinforced by Escort Group 5, which included the escort carrier HMS Biter. When a Wolfpack targeted HX-237, the combination of carrier-borne aircraft and surface escorts fought off the assault effectively. 3 U-boats were sunk at the cost of only 3 merchant ships lost from the convoy. The exchange rate was now 3 submarines per 3 merchant ships, a ratio catastrophic for Germany and acceptable for the Allies. Convoy SC-129 followed. The Wolfpack that attacked it sank 2 merchant vessels, but was driven off with the loss of 1 submarine. Then came Convoy SC-130, and the exchange became so lopsided that it barely qualified as a battle in the traditional sense. 13 Allied warships protected SC-130, along with very long-range B-24 Liberator aircraft, flying from Newfoundland and Northern Ireland. The Wolfpack never achieved a coordinated attack at all. Allied aircraft struck the gathering submarines before they could position themselves. Aggressive hunting by the escorts and patrolling bombers destroyed at least 2 U-boats in the area. On May 25th, Convoy SC-130 arrived in Liverpool completely unscathed, not a single merchant ship lost. This outcome would have been almost unthinkable in March. Convoy HX-239 was equally decisive. 8 escorts and the small carrier HMS Archer kept the U-boats entirely away from the merchant ships. Aircraft from Archer destroyed 1 submarine without any Allied vessels lost. Convoy USGS-84, outbound from Britain, could not be penetrated by the Wolfpack at all, despite the presence of the U.S. Navy escort carrier USS Bogue and her destroyer Screen hunting the surrounding waters. Not a single merchant was lost, while aircraft from Bogue sank 1 of the lurking submarines. The pattern was now unmistakable and consistent. Engagement after engagement, the U-boats were being sunk without proportionate success against the convoys they were attacking. The technology, the trained crews, the support groups, the escort carriers, the long-range aircraft, and the systematic tactical improvements were operating together in exactly the way their developers had hoped, and in exactly the way Dönitz had not anticipated. The cumulative toll on his force across the month was unprecedented in the history of the campaign. Allied records counted approximately 34 U-boats destroyed in the Atlantic during May 1943. Modern analysis of German records shows the actual figure was approximately 40 boats sunk across all operational areas during the month, with roughly 32 of those lost in the North Atlantic convoy zone alone. In the 4 months preceding May 1943, the average monthly U-boat loss had been approximately 14. In May, that figure more than doubled, 1,832 German submariners killed, 183 survivors rescued, nearly 3 times the number of U-boats lost in all of 1941, destroyed in a single month. The qualitative loss compounded the numerical one. The U-boat crews killed in May 1943 included many of the veteran petty officers and junior officers who had accumulated years of Atlantic combat experience and who would have become the next generation of skilled U-boat commanders. These men took their specific accumulated knowledge, their trained judgment about convoy attack geometry and Allied countermeasures, and the particular skills that only combat develops in submarine crews, down with their boats into the North Atlantic. Replacing the boats was something German shipyards could in theory manage, though the rate of construction was being pushed hard. Replacing the human expertise those boats contained was not something any training program could accomplish quickly. The new crews arriving from the training establishment in Germany were going into Atlantic combat, with months of training against the capabilities of 1941 and being asked to fight the capabilities of 1943. The impact inside the U-boat arms operational culture was visible in real time. Frontline U-boat captains filing their patrol reports through May described being swarmed by destroyers that appeared from unexpected directions, being hunted by aircraft in the middle of the night with no warning from their radar detectors, encountering new depth charge attacks that kept them pinned at depth with no opportunity to maneuver clear. The psychological trajectory among the crews shifted from the aggressive confidence that had characterized the happy time to something closer to fatalism. One U-boat commander, having survived a convoy battle in May, described the experience in a phrase that reached Dönitz's headquarters through the routine reporting chain. He said it was like marching the crew to their doom. Morale among U-boat crews was declining in a way that Dönitz understood was not simply a reaction to a difficult month. It was a structural change in how the men perceived their odds. A crew going to sea in 1941 had expected to hunt. A crew going to sea in May 1943 understood that they were as likely to be hunted as hunting, and that the enemy hunting them had capabilities they had not trained against and could not easily evade. Dönitz responded to the May losses with tactical adjustments that reflected genuine strategic confusion about what had gone wrong. On April 27th, even before the worst of the May losses had accumulated, he had ordered U-boats transiting the Bay of Biscay to sail submerged at night rather than on the surface. The intent was to reduce their exposure to Allied aircraft hunting the transit routes. The effect was the opposite, keeping submarines on the surface during daylight for battery charging, while submerging at night made them more visible to the daytime aircraft that Coastal Command had specifically organized to patrol the bay. At least 6 U-boats were destroyed by air patrols over the Bay of Biscay in May alone, submarines that had not even reached the convoy routes yet, but were killed in transit. By late May, the evidence was overwhelming, and Dönitz reached the decision that anyone reviewing the monthly loss figures would eventually reach. He ordered a halt to U-boat operations in the North Atlantic. All remaining submarines were to withdraw from the convoy routes and regroup. They would redeploy to areas beyond effective land-based air coverage. They would wait while German engineers attempted to develop technical countermeasures to the Allied advantages that May had so violently revealed. The new snorkel device, which allowed submarines to run their diesel engines while fully submerged by extending an intake tube to just above the waterline, offered the prospect of reducing the time submarines spent vulnerable on the surface. The Type 21 submarine, a revolutionary new design with dramatically improved battery capacity, streamlined hull, and high submerged speed, was in development, and Dönitz believed its capabilities would eventually restore the U-boat's tactical effectiveness. But these were future solutions. In late May 1943, the Wolfpack that had terrorized the North Atlantic for 2 years was withdrawing from the field. Dönitz's own war diary entries from late May record a man struggling to process the scale of what had occurred. He wrote of the frightful total of losses. He acknowledged that the Allied forces had introduced capabilities he had not anticipated and had not prepared his crews to counter. Adolf Hitler, informed of the withdrawal from the North Atlantic, was dismayed and angry. Hitler had viewed the U-boat campaign as one of Germany's most valuable strategic assets, and the news that it was being suspended indefinitely was not the kind of news a dictator in his position received without fury. Dönitz defended the decision with the only argument available to him. To continue the North Atlantic campaign at the loss rates of May 1943 would simply be to send more crews to their deaths for no strategic return. The boats would return when the technology had caught up with the Allied countermeasures. They did return. Sporadic patrols resumed in the fall of 1943. U-boats continued to fight in the Atlantic until the last days of the war in 1945. Individual U-boats sank Allied ships in every year of the conflict. The campaign never stopped entirely, but the Wolfpack never came back. The concentrated mass attacks on convoys that had produced the happy time figures, the coordinated multi-boat assaults that had made March 1943 the darkest month of the Atlantic campaign, never returned in effective form. When U-boats returned to the North Atlantic in the second half of 1943, they found Allied defenses stronger than they had been in May, and the long-range air coverage more complete. The losses continued at rates that drained the force steadily. The new snorkel-equipped boats were tactically better than their predecessors, but they were entering combat against an Allied anti-submarine capability that had internalized the lessons of May 1943 and had continued improving. The Type 21 submarines that Dönitz had hoped would restore the balance arrived too late and in too few numbers to matter. The strategic significance of Black May is difficult to overstate without resorting to the kind of language that historical events often earn retrospectively, but that loses precision in the earning. Britain's survival in the early years of the war had depended on the Atlantic supply line remaining open. Between 45 and 50 million tons of imports per year were the minimum requirement for Britain to sustain its population and its war production. In the worst months of the U-boat campaign, those imports had been threatened in ways that caused genuine alarm in Churchill's cabinet and in the operational assessment offices of the Admiralty. The stockpiles of food and fuel that Britain maintained against disruption were finite, and the rate at which U-boats were sinking shipping in early 1943 was approaching the rate at which those stockpiles could not be replenished. Equally important was the buildup for the invasion of Europe. The Allied strategic plan that would eventually produce the D-Day landings in June 1944 depended on moving millions of tons of equipment, hundreds of thousands of American troops, and the full material weight of the American industrial mobilization across the Atlantic from the United States to Britain. This movement required the Atlantic to be survivable for merchant shipping. If the U-boat campaign had maintained its March 1943 effectiveness through the summer, and into 1944, the buildup that D-Day required could not have proceeded on the schedule that the strategic plan demanded. May 1943 ended both threats simultaneously. The food supply was secured. The buildup could proceed. The Allied commanders who understood what had happened in the North Atlantic that month immediately began shifting resources away from convoy escort duty to support the Mediterranean campaign and the planning for the eventual invasion of France. The assumption underlying this reallocation was that the Atlantic lifeline was no longer at serious risk. The assumption was correct. The German U-boat arm lost approximately 860 boats sunk during the entire war, with approximately 28,000 submariners killed out of roughly 40,000 who served. The casualty rate of 75% made it the deadliest branch of military service of any nation in the Second World War. The men who fought in the Atlantic from 1939 to 1945 did so, knowing that the odds against them were becoming worse with every patrol, and that the training they had received was increasingly inadequate for the operational environment they entered when they left their base ports. The men who died in May 1943 died in the specific week or day or hour when the accumulated Allied improvements reached the threshold that turned the campaign's mathematics against the Wolfpack irreversibly. The first weeks of May sank boats and crews who had fought effectively through the preceding years. The last weeks of May sank boats and crews who were already aware that something fundamental had changed and who continued patrolling because the orders required them to continue patrolling. One of the U-boat commanders who survived May 1943 was Kapitän Leutnant Rolf Manke of U-358, who completed a North Atlantic patrol in late May and brought his crew back to Brest, having survived 3 separate depth charge attacks across the patrol's duration. He filed his patrol report in the first days of June 1943 and was given 48 hours of shore leave before receiving orders for his next patrol. His post-war memoir, written in 1961, described the state of the crews returning to Brest in late May and early June 1943 with a precision that decades of reflection had not softened into comfortable language. He wrote that the men coming off patrols in those weeks looked different from the men who had come off patrols in 1941 and 1942. Not physically different in any obvious way, differently quiet. He wrote that in 1941, the crews who came in from successful patrols had a specific quality that he described as the confidence of men who understood the terms of what they were doing. In June 1943, the quality he saw in the men coming off patrols was something he said he could only describe as the look of men who had gone somewhere they expected not to return from, and had returned anyway, and were not yet sure what to do with that. He wrote that he himself had sat in the operations room in Brest on June 2, 1943, and looked at the plotting chart showing where the North Atlantic boats were and the dates by which they had been expected to report, and had counted the ones that had not reported. He counted 12 in that one session, 12 boats that had been expected to transmit position reports and had not transmitted anything. 12 crews of between 45 and 55 men each, who were either in Allied captivity or at the bottom of the North Atlantic. He wrote that he sat with that number for a while, and then he went and found his first watch officer and told him they were being assigned to a different patrol area in the South Atlantic, and that the new orders had come through that morning. He wrote that his first watch officer looked at him for a moment and said nothing, and then nodded and went to tell the crew. He wrote that they both understood what the South Atlantic assignment meant. It meant someone in Lorient understood that the North Atlantic was no longer a place where you sent boats and expected them back. Did anyone in your family serve in the Battle of the Atlantic on either side, in the convoys, or in the U-boat fleet? Drop their name in the comments. Let's make sure they are remembered.